Welcome to the Plagues Project.
10 plagues, many angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
Of all biblical stories, the 10 Plagues is probably one of the most famous. First of all, it just captures your imagination. If you heard it once, you're probably going to remember. It is dramatic, it is vivid, it is full of imagery. Once you hear the image of a cloud of darkness coming and covering the entire Egyptian empire in darkness, you're probably not going to forget that. So as far as biblical stories go, it really sort of sticks in your brain. It's one that you're not going to forget. And also, the 10 Plagues is really well known to us because we actually reenact the 10 Plagues during the Passover Seder. During the Passover Seder, if you've ever sat at a Seder before, you might remember that there's a part where you actually dip your finger into your glass of wine and take out one drop of wine for each of the 10 plagues while you read the list or sing the list of the 10 plagues. So because of that, at least for me, the 10 plagues has been sort of in my head for a long time. It's one of the stories I sort of know, I'm familiar with it, I'm very comfortable sort of, oh yeah, the 10 plagues, I've heard of that. But even if you're to ask me what they are, I might not remember them all in order. You might know that there's a part during the Passover Seder when you actually are given an acronym to try to remember the 10 plagues, which just goes to show that a list of 10 things is kind of hard to remember. But it's not like the acronym helps me at all anyway. So with all that being said, even if the 10 plagues is familiar to you, it's worth going back to the Torah, going back to the text, and actually seeing what the story is all about of the 10 plagues. And then as the deeper questions come up from this closer reading, then you can investigate from whatever perspective you find most interesting. So where are we in the Torah? For that, I'd love to show you Sefaria.org, a website that collects Torah texts and Jewish texts. The canon of Jewish literature is a lot of it is available online on Sefaria.org, so go check it out. And when it comes to the 10 plagues, we are in the Tanakh, we're in the Bible, the Jewish Bible, the three-part Jewish Bible, the Tanakh. We are in the first part, which is called the Torah. And we're in the book of Exodus. We're actually in Parshat Va'era, which usually comes around the middle end of January when it comes to a yearly reading. And the 10 plagues span two parshas. It's both Parshat Va'era and Parshat Bo. But the 10 plagues really start around Exodus chapter 7. Okay, so what's happened in the first 7 chapters of Exodus? I'll tell you. A lot. The first few chapters of Exodus are jam-packed. In fact, there's so much that happens in, like, let's say the first 4 chapters of Exodus, that then by the time you get to the chapter 7 with the narrative of the 10 plagues, stuff is really slowed down. It's a really different pace and it's a really close zoom in, which is interesting enough. You might have expected that the story of Moses' life would have merited a zoom in, but no, that came in just a few verses in chapter 2. So already, now that we're in chapter 7 with the plagues, already what has happened? The Israelites are in Egypt. They've had a lot of kids. They're gaining sort of numbers and strength, and Pharaoh's nervous because that looks like possibly power and power of a minority group within his empire. Pharaoh tries to mitigate this problem by killing firstborn male children of the Israelites and then enslaving and oppressing the Israelite people. Moses is born, who we know already when we read that story, we know that Moses is the one who's born in order to grow up and be the person who's going to be the savior who takes those poor oppressed slaves out of Egypt. Moses is born. Moses grows up in the palace, in Pharaoh's house in Egypt. He then leaves Egypt for a pretty dramatic reason and goes out into the desert to become a shepherd. He gets married. And one day when he is out tending the flock, he actually encounters a bush, which is burning, but not being burnt in some way. And out of that bush comes a voice, and it's the voice of God saying, Moses, it's you. You've got to go back to Egypt and free the people of Israel. Now, Moses does not take to this task immediately, and specifically Moses is nervous because he considers himself not a man of words. He says it might be a speech impediment, he has a heaviness of mouth. And he doesn't think that he can go and convince Pharaoh that the Israelite people should go free. And God says, don't worry. You're going to have Aaron with you. Aaron's going to speak on your behalf. And God says, I'm going to bring signs and wonders. And those signs and wonders are going to speak louder than words. And because of my signs and wonders, the Egyptians and Pharaoh are going to be compelled to let the Israelites go. So that's where the story of the plague really picks up, because it's in chapter 7 that God is reminding Moses of these signs and wonders that are going to be in Moses' back pocket when he's nervous talking to Pharaoh. God says, Moses, don't worry, these signs and wonders are going to come. You don't have to be nervous talking to Pharaoh. It's the signs and wonders that are going to convince the Egyptians that it's time to go. So the Lord says to Moses, see, I place you in the role of God to Pharaoh with your brother Aaron as your prophet. You shall repeat all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh to let the Israelites depart from his land. But, says God, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. God is saying to Moses, this is not going to be a one-shot deal. It's not going to be one time you go in and I show one sign and marvel, and Pharaoh's going to let the people go. No, in fact, God says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that this has to happen a few times, that I may multiply my signs and marvels. We know there's going to be 10 in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not heed you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and deliver my ranks, my people, the Israelites, from the land of Egypt with extraordinary chastisements. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from their midst. So that has set up the drama, and now the 10 plagues are going to start. So let me just remind everybody what the 10 plagues are. They are blood, frogs, lice, flies, pestilence, which basically means like cattle disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and then the big 10th plague, the one that actually seals the deal and convinces Pharaoh that the Israelites should go free, is the killing of the firstborn. So these are the 10 plagues, and these might look familiar to you, but I want to actually just kind of go a little bit deeper into each of them to show you what's working here in this list of 10. You might want to think about this list of 10 as being separated into 3 groups of 3, and then the final one. Blood, frogs, lice, flies, pestilence, boils, hail, locust, darkness, and then killing of the firstborn. Now, why would we group them like that? So the first 3, blood, frogs, and lice, these are the ones where Moses and Aaron are bringing these signs and marvels on God's behalf, but Pharaoh has magicians, and the magicians are saying, oh, blood, pish posh, we can do blood. And so even when Moses and Aaron turn the Nile into a river of blood, the magicians in Egypt are able to do it too. So it doesn't really change the stakes of the game at all. And so too with frogs. They bring frogs, which is my favorite plague. They bring frogs, and the magicians are able to replicate frogs in some way too. So it doesn't really convince Pharaoh and the Egyptians that God is all powerful. That changes with lice. So that's our first 3, blood, frogs, lice. Because when lice comes, the magicians try to replicate the lice and they're not able to. And you might think about why it is that lice is sort of outside of the realm of possibility of a regular old Egyptian magician. And what we like to say is that lice are so small, and God's signs and marvels can operate even at a level that small. Lice is the smallest level that the magicians couldn't reach. Anything smaller than a little lice, the Egyptian magicians can't do it. God can do lice no problem, and God can operate and perform God's wonders at levels even smaller than lice. But lice is where that's the lice that broke the Egyptians' back. So that's the first 3. Now that God's power has been confirmed, God is going to showcase God's power. So we have swarms of insects, we have cattle disease, and we have boils. And these 3 are grouped together for a few reasons. First, they're all kind of natural plagues, right? You can imagine swarms of insects happening. You can imagine a disease happening, coming to Egypt and killing all the cattle. And you can imagine an epidemic that causes a bunch of boils on the people. So they're all natural. But just because they're don't be fooled, because these are still God's plagues. They are not a natural, sudden, terrible event in Egypt, but could be explained naturally. And the reason you know that is because actually God brings these plagues only on the Egyptians. The Israelites are not affected by these plagues at all. So in these three, God is saying, I'm going to bring a bunch of natural plagues to really afflict you, but I'm going to show you that I control it. I can show you that I can put a natural plague over here, and these people over here aren't going to be touched by it at all. Then comes the next three: hail, locusts, and darkness. Darkness is a really good one. It's also one of my favorites. Okay, so hail, locusts, and darkness are all not natural. The hail, it's coming down as fire and ice together. It's a totally inconceivable natural event. The locusts come down as a swarm, and so much such a swarm that it actually covers the entire ground so that you can't really see. And that not seeing is confirmed in the ninth plague, when actually everything becomes dark. So these are not natural plagues, and they are all kind of operating in the theme of darkness, right? Hail that is fire and ice. It's like, is there light coming? What is the light? I need to stay inside. Then the locusts are outside and they're covering everything, and you can't really see out your window, and then you can't see at all. And perhaps one of the reasons that this escalating series of plagues has sort of culminated in the theme of darkness maybe is because this is Egypt. And if you're trying to pit the power of our God, the Jewish God, against the Egyptians, then you have to be fighting God versus gods. And the most powerful of the Egyptian gods would have been the sun god. And so at this climactic moment, God is saying, oh, your sun god? Let me just show you what darkness really is. And he does it through hail, he does it through locusts, and God does it through darkness. And then we get to the final plague, which of course is the most famous, and it's also the most devastating and the most brutal, which is the killing of the firstborn. And this is the plague that, of course, finally convinces Pharaoh that the Israelites do need to be set free. And this perhaps is kind of a bookend to the way that the story started, because if Pharaoh sentenced the Jewish firstborn babies to be thrown into the Nile to their death, so too now the Egyptians are feeling the symmetrical version of that experience in the death of their firstborns too. So those are the 10 plagues. And now that you remember them all over again, you might have some questions. You might be wondering something theological, a theological question. Why did there have to be plagues at all? Why couldn't God just be like, nope, boop, boop, boop. Jewish people are freed. I'm going to free them. I'm God. Why did there have to be plagues? Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart in order for there to be 10 plagues? Why did it have to happen this way? What was God trying to prove? You might have a historical question. Is there any evidence that these plagues occurred or could possibly have occurred? What's the archaeology? What evidence? What's the nature in Egypt that would have maybe led to these being the plagues? Can we explain them in some way? You might have literary questions. Why these plagues? Are there any patterns in the plagues? What are the plagues trying to evoke literarily and through imagery? And of course, you might have a modern question. What about plagues in our time? What can we learn from the 10 biblical plagues in order to better understand what really is a plague? And what do we do? Of course, right now, this is the question on all of our minds. What do we do when we're actually confronted with a plague in our time, in our midst?